friends, welcome to the Cripple Chronicles, a podcast about a Lazarus frames, amputation and the journey to accepting and embracing disability. My name is Becca and I am your friendly neighbourhood cripple and host. On today's episode of the Cripple Chronicles, I am going to be talking about the end of 2021, going into the start of last year, timeline of post-accident, thinking about getting my leg amputated, being back in contact with my ex. Not going to talk in depth about that relationship today, getting back out of the house and into the world and having input from orthotics and physio and how that was progressing my recovery. Before I get into it, if you are watching on YouTube, you know the score. Give me a like, subscribe. If you're listening on audio platforms, rate and review. And let's get into this week's episode of the Cripple Chronicles. For a good year or so, my gran had been telling me that I should put my name down on the council list and get a house that is more accessible for me, but I didn't want to feel as if I was just being given something. I felt as if I had to work for it. I was starting to feel like that wasn't really going to be possible. I wasn't going to have the money to do that. Since I moved out when I was 18, I had been staying in my grandparents' old house, which was owned by my dad. And it had always been the plan that when my dad was 55, he was probably going to move back into that house. This was a plan before I had my accident. I had said to my dad when we had a chat about it that if he was to move back in, I would be probably moving out because I don't think I could go back to living with one of my parents. I didn't really stay long term with my dad when I was younger, so it would have been a whole new thing, and I liked just having my independence and not having to ask when people could come round. Anyway, the time was drawing closer to my dad hitting 55 and retiring. When we had the conversation in maybe 2020 or 2021, we had spoke about my stepmom being allergic to Simba, and it was the case at that time that I would either have to move out or I would have to make the decision to get rid of Simba, which really wasn't an option to me. Like, Simba is basically my child. I've said to a few friends, like, most of the time when I came round from surgeries, when I was doped up on all the medication they gave me, I ended up crying, saying how much I missed my cat, and that just shows how much he really means to me, and I couldn't give him up. I did the application for housing near the end of December 2021, and when I had initially spoke about it with my ex, we had actually spoke about getting a flat together because it would be better for the both of us. However, to do that, it needed proof of address from him and like identification documents, which I told him was needed, but I wasn't going to chase him for them. And when it came round to getting offered somewhere, he hadn't given me any of those documents, so it was just my name that was going on the tenancy. It was a pretty good thing that that was how it worked out when I'd made the decision that it was just going to be me, that I'd stuck to it. In January of 2022, I was able to go back into the city centre for the first time. It was a lot of anxiety. There was a lot of people about that weren't really looking where they were going. Even if their pals saw me coming, they didn't bother to mention it so that they could move out of the way or not step backwards and nearly step into me. There was people who were inches away from my frame And it just made me so anxious that somebody was going to go into me or hurt me because they weren't paying attention to their surroundings and I was paying so much attention to mine. The pavement conditions in the city centre are pretty poor, and it is somewhere where I've still not managed to be on my own, even since having my leg amputated, because I just don't feel safe enough. I don't feel confident enough that I would be able to get myself about without getting stuck because of the conditions of the pavements. When we went out that first time, although I could feel people looking at me and kind of wondering what had happened, there was reminders of the good people that when we did get stuck on pavements that they stopped and offered to help. A week later, I had another clinic appointment with my surgeon. My ex came with me to this appointment and I was brave enough to ask to see my x-rays. This was something that I had always been very curious about, especially when I was going to appointments and that they were telling me that the x-rays looked good. I was always very curious to kind of see what my leg looked like when I initially broke it and the point that it was at in my healing. However, at this appointment, I did ask to see my x-rays. It was just the ones that they had taken that day, but looking at them, I could understand why they were saying that it needed more time. When looking at the bone, I could see that the part of bone that I had grown and that was getting stronger was more see-through than the rest of the bone in my leg, which meant it just wasn't quite strong enough yet. And at this appointment, they told me that realistically, it was probably going to be another 3 to 6 months. I had said, at what point do we decide that enough is enough and this isn't going to work? And he had told me that amputation has always been an option, and after the conversation I had had with the registrar at the appointment a few weeks before, where they had said that they weren't going to amputate if my leg was healthy, I had brought that up to him and he said, at the end of the day, it has always been your decision when this ends. I think hearing that was something that I really needed on the way back. I had a serious think about it and I decided that if by October, November last year, if my leg wasn't healed, then I was going to get it amputated anyway, because I just couldn't do it anymore. And 3 years of my life trying to save my leg was long enough. When I got my second frame, I had an orthopaedic shoe, which was basically a bit of foam with some straps on it, and I had a heel raise inside of my shoe to compensate for the fact that my ankle was dropping. After one clinic appointment that I had went to, I was talking about my shoe and how it wasn't really helping, and my surgeon had called the physio to come down. At this appointment, they made me a DIY orthopaedic shoe where they basically cut the sole off of another shoe, stuck it to the bottom of the shoe I already had, and then just wrapped a lot of tape around it, and then I still had the heel raise on the inside. And bearing in mind, this was meant to be a temporary fix. However, I had this shoe for almost a year. When I had went to physio, I had spoke about maybe getting a new shoe, and we got somebody from the orthotics department involved, which are the people who deal with adapting shoes. When I had been in the hospital initially, when I got my first frame, because I had about 7 centimetres of a length discrepancy, I got some Vans and I got them adapted so that the right shoe was larger. However, because of my foot dropping down, these weren't suitable anymore, and the shoes that I got initially were like Vans slip-ons, thinking that they were going to be easier for me to get on, but they were actually so much harder. So at this appointment with the physio and the orthotics lady, I got measured for an adapted shoe. So they got me to stand up and see how much had to be built up, how my foot was tilting in, They took all the measurements they needed, and then it was my job to go home and find a trainer that was suitable for adapting. And the only trainers I really had were trainers that I wore from being on placement and nursing. And there was one of them that I thought was going to be really good, but I just couldn't get my foot into it. And then the second pair were a bit flimsy, but it was a case of time. I didn't have time to go pick up a new pair of shoes. All of the shoes that the orthotics lady had said might be suitable were 80, 90 quid, and I couldn't afford to pay that for a pair of trainers to get adapted, that they might not even be comfortable or fit me. They wanted them by the end of the day. So it was very stressful. I got very upset, very in my own head of why does nothing ever go simple? Why can't it just be straightforward? Why does everything have to be a struggle? However, my ex took the shoes up to the orthotics department and they got them adapted for me. After I got this new shoe, it really helped me start to progress in my recovery. I don't know if I had mentioned it previously, I think I did. At physio, I was using scales to record how much body weight I was managing to put through the frame, because we had had conversations when I was walking and my physio had said to me, how much percentage of weight do you think you're putting through your frame? And I knew it was more than I was able to do at the start, but I didn't know how much of a difference it was. And I found it very hard to put that into some kind of scale. So we got the scales out. It was a case of I stood one foot on a wee ramp so that I was up a bit, and then I just put as much weight through the frame as I could. When I started doing it, it was a struggle. The aim was to get 28 kilograms through the frame and manage to maintain it. It was hard to kind of maintain it at 25 to start off with. I managed to work my way up to about 40, 41 kilograms. Then it was a bit stagnant for a couple of months where I thought that it was just, that was the point that I was going to be able to get to. But my goal was being able to put half my body weight through my frame, which was roughly 45 kilograms. Only a month after getting my new shoe, I was able to not only hit my goal of 45 kilograms, but exceed it. The first time I tried, I put 48 kilograms of weight through my frame. My physio had said that when I was having a rest that I was so close to 50 and I just wanted to try and hit that 50 kg mark. So I tried it again and I hit 51.8. Only a month of having my shoe and I had already been able to put another 10 kilograms of weight through my frame. I was absolutely bursting with pride for myself. Going from thinking that physio was a waste of time a year previously to actually being able to achieve the goals that I was setting for myself was such a massive win. I really felt like being able to put that weight through the frame only meant good things for my bone healing and my bone density. March of 2022 is something that I think of as a massive, massive lesson to myself, even if at the time I didn't know that it was going to be. Eleanor down in Leeds, one of my fellow cripples, was having pretty major surgery done to do with her veins due to blood clots because of childhood abuse. The health service is severely struggling, and after this surgery, Eleanor was meant to be laying flat for at least 48 hours. However, she was discharged the same day as her having the surgery. A week or so later, she had a massive blood clot, probably the size of like 2 fists together. They had said that they didn't think the surgery had been successful and there was a potential that she might lose both of her legs. I knew as soon as I heard that I had to go to Leeds. It wasn't a want, it was a need. It was that feeling really in my chest where it felt as if I was pulled to go there because I couldn't be 300 miles away when this was happening. I had to be closer. I had to do something, even if it was just showing up. My ex had came over, and one of the first things I said to him was, I've been looking at trains and hotels to go to Leeds, and I really need you to tell me that this is a bad idea. And he sat down and he looked at me and he was like, I can't do that, but I can support you to get there. Over the next 2 days, I found an accessible hotel, looked at prices for trains, phoned the booking office to ask about accessibility and wheelchair spaces on the trains. I booked my assistance through the travel app. We were going to Leeds. It was daunting. I had went from basically being bedbound and hardly leaving the house, never mind the town that I stayed in for 2 years, and I was taking this trip to Leeds. But I knew I had to do it. We got on the train and we were on our way. The anxiety was building, but I was also just excited that I was being able to do it. When we got into Leeds, I thought it was very interesting that in the disabled toilet they had an emergency car and a hoist, and that's not something that you really see a lot of the time in Glasgow, which was something that made me think that this is a very disabled friendly city. We had went to find somewhere for some food, but I was feeling very overwhelmed and I just wanted to go back to the hotel and check in and lie down. So that's what we did. And later on, we went out and had a wander about and took in the sights of Leeds, tried to find somewhere for us to get some dinner. It was the first time that I had stayed outside of my house since the accident, other than being in hospital. The hotel we stayed in was definitely a cheaper option as it was a last minute plan. The room was pretty compact, but there was enough room for me to move about in my wheelchair and turn around. The bed was comfy enough. The bathroom was pretty standard. I wasn't able to actually use the toilet because of the frame, so I had to take my shiwi everywhere with me so that I was still able to pee, and I just accepted for the few days that we were down there I was going to have to hold in the number twos. The next day we went to go and see Eleanor, and I was so excited because it was the first time that I was going to be inside of her house, and she is so creative, and obviously chatting to her over FaceTime and seeing videos of her, I've saw what her house looks like, and she's such a creative person and it's just so funky. So I was excited to be in that space, but I was really just looking forward to seeing her and giving her a hug and telling her that it was going to be okay. Whilst leaving the hotel, we tried to book a taxi, but I think we called about 6 different companies and they all didn't have wheelchair accessible taxis available. We had already tried being on buses where I had stayed, and I thought, well, it's not going to be much different, and it wasn't much different. So we just got on the bus to go instead because there was a stop pretty near to Eleanor's house, so that worked for us. Before we had set off to go to Leeds, I had spoke to Jonathan, as there are steps outside of the house and then there is also another 4 steps inside. He had sent me pictures of these, so I knew what I was getting myself into. When I actually saw it in front of me, it definitely looked a bit more daunting. The 8 stairs outside, I just took my time as I was getting up them. My ex and Jonathan were outside with me. One of them was in front of me, one of them was behind me. And then from inside, I could hear Eleanor and Faye cheering me on, telling me that I could do it, saying that I was nearly there. And that was so important. It is something that has really stuck with me, especially now on difficult days or when my anxiety is really getting a hold of me that I can't do something. I remember them cheering me on and how much they believe that I can do it, and it really helps affirm that belief in myself. We just chatted and laughed and had some food. And before I left, I remember hugging Eleanor and telling her that if I could do this with a frame on and with how limited my mobility had been, I hope that she knows that whatever happens with her legs, that we will get through it. I didn't know that 6 months later it was going to be such a massive lesson to myself and have it totally flipped the other way around, where Eleanor had that intense feeling where she thought that she had to come to Glasgow because I was going to lose one of my legs. We had booked a taxi to go back to the hotel on Uber, requesting a wheelchair taxi, but of course they just sent a normal taxi, and my ex had went out to say to them and they tried to tell us that I hadn't booked a wheelchair taxi, which I double checked and I had. So we just decided to go back to the bus stop and get the bus back into the city centre. And as we were going to get the bus, we passed the taxi sitting waiting down the road. Later found out that he had been waiting there so that I could get charged a fee for not turning up, even though they had sent me the wrong taxi. Don't worry, I swiftly got my money back as soon as I realised what they had done. While waiting for the bus, the street was quite busy, but there was a car that I noticed driving past a few times, and I think maybe on the third time they started shouting stuff out of the window. I can't even remember what they were shouting, but they came around a second time, and I can just remember thinking, like, fuck me, man, do you not have anything better to do with your weekend than shout out of a car at a cripple that's literally just waiting for the bus to go back to our hotel? Like, wisen up, man. We headed home the next day after going to a little market where I managed to find a great pair of trousers for £5 that were so comfortable when I had the frame on, and I still wear them now because, of course, they're yellow, they're my vibe. I had always said since this trip, if I was going to be a long-term wheelchair user, that I would seriously consider moving to Leeds because of how cripple-friendly it is. During the few days that we were in Leeds, there was times when we were going about the city centre where I felt comfortable enough to be able to push myself, which wasn't ever possible when we were going about in Scotland. I didn't feel like the pavement conditions were safe enough. I mean, some of the people in Leeds still gave me dirty looks, and almost like when it was busy and nobody could get anywhere, I was getting looked at as if it was my fault because I was taking up more space, but it wasn't anything to do with me. But it seemed less than in Glasgow. The only issues that we had with pavements was where they were doing roadworks to actively make the pavements better. A lot of the places that we passed by, if they didn't have ramps, they had just a small lift that takes a wheelchair to go up and in. So many things like that made me think that it would be a good place to live, and it is something that I'm definitely thinking about, but I am very much starting to get settled where I am just now, and I would rather get a lot of other things under control before I start uprooting my life. Like I had said, this trip wasn't without its little hitches. People in public giving me the dirty looks. When getting off of one of the trains home, we were waiting for a guy to come with the ramp, and an old man had come up and offered to like bump me down off of the train as if I was a pram and not a person in a wheelchair. And we had also changed trains, and when we got to the last change, the guy who was working at the station had forgot that we were coming, and the driver or whoever was at the station wasn't able to put a ramp onto the train, so we had to wait, and we waited about 10-15 minutes, but in this 10-15 minutes, the train that we were going to get on for the final part of the journey home had been and gone, which meant we then needed to wait another half an hour for a train, which was very frustrating because I was tired and sore and I really just wanted my bed at this point. I had a physio appointment not long after I got back from Leeds, and I was so excited to tell them that I had managed to do it and I had managed to get up the stairs at Eleanor's, because I think without having that new shoe and the work that I had been doing at physio, that wouldn't have been possible. The level of excitement that I had was clearly radiating off me, because the physios had initially thought that I had either been offered a house or I had got engaged, but me taking a trip to Leeds and being able to do the stuff that I did was pretty much on par with that. We got the scales out and I was managing to put 2/3 of my body weight through the frame, which felt like a massive win. It really showed me that pushing myself to do things was working. It was paying off. I was seeing the results physically, even if the frame had to stay on and my bone wasn't strong enough yet. I was seeing the differences that I was being able to make. I went home and I told my pals, and I had saved the video and I posted that video on TikTok because I had been slacking on the content on TikTok. I just hadn't been in the right headspace for it. Through that video, I received a message from a reporter from the Scottish Sun who wanted to write an article about me, and I was definitely a bit dubious about this. I mean, I was like searching him up, making sure that he was actually a reporter, because I was like, what is going on here? The Scottish Sun are definitely not a reputable newspaper company, a media outlet. However, it was a good way to get my story out, and I had kind of accepted it. And then after chatting to the guy, I got very anxious because I just started to think, how are they going to spin this? Is it going to end up making me look bad? And just feeling a lot of anxiety about it, but it actually ended up being a pretty well written article. I shall link it in the description if you want to have a read of this article. But I mean, you've pretty much already listened to 6.5 hours of content about it, so it's going to be things that you've already heard before. In April of last year, I got a call from one of the council's occupational therapists who had said that a flat had came up as available and they thought it was going to be suitable for me. I'm pretty sure she actually said, oh, it's going to be perfect for you. I got a viewing to go see it very quickly after, and as soon as I went to see the flat, I knew that I possibly couldn't say no to it. There is so much space, a back garden, somewhere that could finally feel like home. Moving house isn't something that I saw myself doing with the frame on. It came with its own lot of complications and road bumps. I went to look for a couch just for people that were going to be coming to visit me and spend time with me, because I knew that I probably wasn't going to be able to sit on it. I had to actually have more thought into getting a couch and go and try different things out, but I wanted somewhere that people could sit when they came over to visit me. Because I was moving council districts, it meant that I had to get all new OT equipment, as I couldn't take the stuff that I already had. I met up with the OT at the flat and we had a chat and did an assessment about the different things that I might need. I still had carer support, and the company that I was under didn't cover the area that I was moving to. So that meant that I was going to have to change over carers, which meant social work involvement. So I phoned them up and I was told that I wasn't actually under a social worker anymore, which, when having carers in, I'm pretty sure they're meant to be reviewing it every so often, but that just didn't happen. And this was before I got offered the flat. I had already come across the road bump about not having a social worker when talking about OT equipment and things like that. It took roughly about 3 months, I think, for me to properly get allocated someone. But that meant that my moving date was pushed back, and I had then sorted everything else out. B was coming over with her partner in a van to help me get some stuff in. My dad was coming to help me, and my friend Eve was also coming to help like build furniture and help kind of put things together in the flat. I think it was maybe 3 or 4 days before moving day, I got a phone call from a social worker who told me that they weren't going to be able to sort the carer support. I was really panicking. I already had everything planned. I didn't want to push it back any further. I was pretty much nearly all packed. I phoned my brother upset, and he took it into his own hands, and he phoned up the MP and had basically said, look, this is a joke. It's been going on for months. We just need something sorted. Can you please just sort it out? And within the end of the day, I was told that the carers would start from the Monday, and I was moving in on the Saturday, which suited me. Over the time between getting the keys and moving day, I was slowly packing my life over the last 6 years into boxes and getting rid of a lot of stuff that I didn't need to take with me on the move. Ryan, as a housewarming present, got me laminate and put it down for me. After I had signed for the keys, I applied for a white goods grant that would help get some money for a fridge, a cooker and a washing machine. I think these grants can go up to about £700. When I was allocated my grant, I was given £350, which panicked me a little because all of the places that I was looking at was at least £500 for those 3 appliances, and I didn't know how I was going to afford it. But I managed to find a little shop that I'm not sure how legitimate the appliances are, maybe off of the back of a lorry, because I managed to get all 3 of them and installation for the £350. But they work, and I couldn't afford anything else, and that's just how the cookie crumbles sometimes. I had my OT equipment in place, and then I moved. Me and my ex were still together at this point, but things were very strained. He was pretty much living with me before I moved. He spent very little time back home at his mum's, and I remember saying to him that I wasn't going to get caught out for frauding the council or the benefits in some kind of way, because if he was living with me, it affected my benefits, it affected my tenancy. If it got found out that he was living with me, then I could potentially lose my flat, and I wasn't prepared to put myself in that situation for another human being. This conversation came about because he was looking at jobs and he was talking about working from home, and that meant working from my flat. And I was like, you can't do that. I have council-based carers coming into my house, and if you are working from home, you are claiming that this then is your home, and it's not. That caused an argument, and he ended up leaving. And like he does quite a lot of the time, he shut down and he just pretended like I didn't exist. And I was done. I wasn't going to let somebody treat me like this anymore. Not a chance. I've already said that the next episode is going to be about these things, so you're going to get some more context for why I wasn't doing it anymore. But that's all you're getting. That's all you're getting in this episode. You'll need to come back next week for the tea on that. So I had my OT equipment in the house, but I was going to be able to get a shower. However, I couldn't sit in the shower normally. My bathroom wasn't wide enough for me to have my leg outstretched with my ankle dropped down for me to shower. So that meant I had to sit facing towards the bathroom, and then there was a lot of water on the floor, which then made it unsafe for me to stand up with my crutches in the bathroom because the floor was wet. It was a lot of anxiety because I was so scared about falling or doing more damage to myself because the floor was wet. And we started talking about adapting the bathroom. So that meant getting people in from the council to move the toilet slightly, move the sink, make it a smaller sink, one that doesn't have a pedestal down to the floor so that there was more room underneath it so that I had more leg room. And then I also got one of the shower screens so that I could put it around my frame so that the water wasn't going out into the bathroom and making the floor soaking. When I moved, I think I had mentioned this in a previous episode, I started using my wheelchair more around the house because I was living somewhere that was wheelchair accessible and that allowed me to do that. But initially, I felt really guilty about it because when I initially got out of hospital, I was told that the main way my bone is going to get better is if I put weight on it, and I should avoid using my wheelchair and I should be moving about on my feet as much as possible. But moving into somewhere that was wheelchair accessible, I was still getting up and moving about, but it meant that I was able to do more because I was able to sit in my wheelchair and do a washing or make my breakfast, hang the washing up, do the dishes. Some days when I had less energy because I'd done more, I was able to let my body recuperate a bit by using my wheelchair instead of focusing on constantly pushing myself to the point of burnout because I'm trying to put more weight through my leg. That is where I am going to end it for today. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Cripple Chronicles. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe on YouTube, leave a comment, follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Cripple Chronicles Pod, rate and review on Spotify and all audio platforms. What else? There is something else. Email if you have anything you would like to chat to me about. Send me an email at cripplecchroniclespod@gmail.com. Next week's episode, I have mentioned it a few times. I am going to talk about some of the things I experienced in childhood, and a large, if not the whole theme of this episode, is going to be about alcoholism. So if you are somebody who is triggered by this, I would maybe suggest skipping this episode. However, it is something that I have always felt shame around talking about, and I know it's not something to be ashamed of. So I hope you tune in and listen next week because I think it could be a very important episode. Anyway, I hope you have a lovely day, week, whatever. I'll see you next week. Bye!